This is the lecture for Module 5. In this module, we are looking at psychedelics, transpersonal psychology, and Whitehead's philosophy as a means of interpreting the strange experiences that psychedelic chemicals can induce in human experimenters. So there is ample reason to be cautious with your own experimentation with these substances. We are studying the experiences of others. Maybe some of you have had experiences, but certainly nothing that that I say or that we read should be read as sort of an invitation to undergo these experiments yourself. This is risky stuff. There's more research being done today after several decades of prohibition, right? Obviously in the 1960s, psychedelics just emerged on the scene, transformed culture, and there was a conservative backlash that pushed these things underground. There was a lot of fear stirred up that maybe was overblown. It does seem like now that clinical trials have been going on for about a decade, there's been a renaissance in medical and psychiatric interest in these substances because of their healing potential, but nonetheless, they are still, when used in the wrong circumstances, quite risky. One is literally putting one's sanity on the line when ingesting these chemicals. And by sanity, I mean that our normal, rational, egoic, waking consciousness is, in a whole variety of ways, relativized or even just dissolved, sometimes dismembered and destroyed by these chemicals, which is why I am putting psychedelics and transpersonal psychology, readings for both of these subjects in this module, because they're quite related, right? Transpersonal psychology also emerges out of the 1960s with psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Stanislav Grof, who are recognizing that even those who possess a sort of healthy ego personality, as measured by the metric of their society, might still want to go beyond this normal egoic rational consciousness to make contact with something greater than themselves, though not in the way that traditional religions had described, but in a more individual way, perhaps. So transpersonal psychology emerges out of what you might call the desire for spirituality without religion, and it has now become an academic field of inquiry trying to understand the further reaches of human potential. So we read an essay by Sherry Kling on the relevance of Whitehead's cosmology to transpersonal psychology. We read an essay of mine that looks at the role that psychedelics played in the emergence of transpersonal psychology and looks at the participatory approach to studying transpersonal experience and to studying psychedelic experience. I don't want to equate the two, but they're certainly intimately related, right? Jorge Ferrer, who now teaches in the Integral and Transpersonal Psychology program at CIIS, as well as Jacob Sherman, the chair of our own program, PCC. They co-authored an edited volume, I think it came out in 2008, that was called The Participatory Turn, which looked at how participatory theory was a new research method, a new way of interpreting religious experience, a new way of studying religion. And I talk about that in my essay. Jorge Ferrer also wrote a book, I think it came out in 2001 or 2002, called Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, which was where he laid out this new participatory vision. And in my essay, I'm trying to connect this participatory vision coming out of Ferrer's work and Jake Sherman's work to an approach to the study of religion developed by Robert Bellah. Bellah wrote a book, his final book, published in 2011 before he passed away, called Religion in Human Evolution, where he connects religion to non-ordinary experiences that he links to play, or what gets called offline sorts of behaviors, where online behaviors would be those where an animal is, doing what it needs to do to survive, right? And offline behaviors would be things like play, where there's no immediate purpose beyond just the joy of doing it. And Bellah thinks that we can trace the cultivation of these play states, these play behaviors from mammals through primates to early human beings, and see how religion, first in the form of ritual, emerged out of these offline behaviors, and that all of human culture, in a sense, could be understood as derived from an elaboration upon what becomes possible in these bouts of play, right? So I connect the participatory turn to Bellah's work on the history of and evolution of religion, and hopefully you find that essay interesting. We also read a essay by a trio of anesthesiologists who are recounting William James's experiments with nitrous oxide. So let's begin there with William James. He, in the 1870s, was experimenting with nitrous, and he reviewed in the Atlantic magazine a book it was a pamphlet actually, by another philosopher and poet, Benjamin Blood. And Blood's pamphlet was called The Anesthetic Revelation and the Gist of Philosophy. And in this pamphlet, Blood is describing his own experiments with nitrous oxide. And James wants to take the opportunity to talk a bit about his own experiences and review some of the philosophical claims or implications that Blood is drawing out of his experiences. For James, right, he's an open-ended relational thinker. That's his attitude toward life and toward truth. He's a pragmatist. He wants to see if these experiences might have some healing effect, might have some epistemological or even ontological significance. James says in this review of Blood's experiences, he said, when a man comes forward with a mystical experience of his own, the duty of the intellect towards it is not suppression, but interpretation, right? So James says that in his own experiences with with nitrous oxide, he had what he refers to as an ontologic emotion, right? So there's a strong sense that a reality is revealed under the influence of these chemicals that is not otherwise apparent to us in our ordinary rational waking consciousness, and that, as far as James is concerned, and Blood as well, we need to take these emotions seriously. James's famous quote from his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, says that, there's more than just our rational waking consciousness, right? James says, there's no account of the universe in its totality that can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. They may determine attitudes, though they cannot furnish formulas, he says. They may open a region, though they fail to give a map. At any rate, he continues, they forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. Looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. So, what is that metaphysical significance? Well, in Blood's recounting, this anesthetic revelation, he says, is the initiation of man into the immemorial mystery of the open secret of being, right? And, nitrous oxide is also called laughing gas. And so there is a way in which, as Blood puts it, the majestic and the absurd are of equal dignity, and we can see in the excerpt from James's writing later, he wrote an essay called On Some Hegelianisms, I think, was the title, where he enters, he inserts a note at the very end of this essay to talk about his experience with laughing gas, when all of a sudden Hegel's philosophy made sense to him. He's usually a critic of Hegel, of absolute idealism, of this sense of some divine totality which erases or negates all differences and absorbs our finite self into something infinite. James recounts his experience of experiencing this infinite. He even excerpts some of his writing, which you might find silly or absurd. He admits as much, but says that, the scribbles that he was able to note down during his experience, really, he admits they fail to capture this ontologic emotion he was experiencing. But nonetheless, I think you might get some sense for the state that James was in as you read this excerpt. I pasted it into the assignment page under the other readings. You can kind of imagine, James at candlelight hunched over his desk with a half-empty bag of nitrous. You heat up ammonium nitrate and fill these bags and then huff them. That's how they would do this substance back in the 1870s. And you can kind of imagine James scribbling on a sheet of paper, kind of giggling to himself as he tries to make sense of this psychedelic experience. And, he wasn't the first to try to recount or make an account of these experiences. Later on in the 20th century, of course, Aldous Huxley experienced mescaline and ended up writing about this in The Doors of Perception, a short book he published on his experiences. Alan Watts, of course, published The Joyous Cosmology, recounting his experience with LSD. So there are a variety of really wonderful accounts of these experiences that you might want to take a look at. James does a decent job, I think, describing the paradoxes of this experience, which, he wants to relate to mystical experience. He thinks it does give him some insight into the sublime emotions that are reported by religious mystics. So, of course, I should just give you a little background on nitrous. Nitrous oxide was discovered in 1772 by the English chemist Joseph Priestley, and about 25 years later, another English chemist, Humphrey Davy, started experimenting with it. Davy was good friends with the English poet Coleridge, who had his own experiments with the substance. Coleridge, of course, preferred opium. He wrote his famous poem Kubla Khan under the influence of opium. So there's, a long history of psychedelic, mind-altering substances being used by philosophers and poets to reveal something about the nature of reality that is otherwise hidden to us, right? And so James is not the first, but he's one in a lineage of thinkers that continued into the 20th century who urged others to repeat this experiment because for him, it revealed a truth that lies, in his words, a truth that lies open to the view in depth beneath depth of almost blinding evidence, wherein the center and the periphery of things seem to come together, right? And just like Blood said, for James in this experience with nitrous or laughing gas, he seemed to experience a convergence of reason, rationality, and silliness. And while he was convinced momentarily of the Hegelian philosophy, he realized as the substance wore off that it leads only to a kind of indifferentism, in James's terms, where all differences are negated and one is left with nothing, in a way. So, James ends up saying from his essay reviewing Blood's pamphlet, James says, "There is no complete generalization, no total point of view, no all-pervasive unity, but everywhere some residual resistance to verbalization, formation, and discursification, some genius of reality that escapes from the pressure of the logical finger that says, hands off, and claims its privacy, and means to be left to its own life. In every moment of immediate experience is somewhat absolutely original and novel. Philosophy must pass from words that reproduce but ancient elements to life itself that gives the integrally new, the inexplicable, the mystery, as what the intellect, with its claim to reason out reality, thinks that it is in duty bound to resolve. But it remains as something to be met and dealt with by faculties more akin to our activities and heroisms and willingnesses than to our logical powers. This is the anesthetic insight, according to our author, Benjamin Blood. So in other words, James does not think that logic or intellect can help us interpret these experiences, whether we're talking about psychedelic experiences or religious, or spiritual, mystical experiences. We need other faculties more akin to the faculty of will, the faculty of heroism, he says, which is interesting to describe heroism as a faculty, but it's our ability to take a risk, to go on an adventure, to push ourselves beyond the normal bounds of human perception and cognition, to see what there might be beyond the doors of perception, right? Beyond the veil of our normal waking consciousness. So if William James had Benjamin Blood as sort of an explorer of these states of consciousness who's trying to translate that into philosophy, we have our Benjamin Blood is Peter Josted, who wrote a book called Pneumatics about his psychedelic experiences and their relevance to philosophy. I'm holding it in my hand here. It was published in 2015. And Peter, who I've had the opportunity to meet, just finished his PhD in philosophy. I believe he was at Exeter University in the UK. He studied with one of the panpsychist analytic philosophers that we read in earlier modules, Galen Strawson. And Peter's trying to develop what he calls a psychedelic phenomenology, or PsyPhen for short. He thinks that this psychedelic phenomenology, a psychedelic experience, is fuel for philosophy. And he thinks that phenomenology as it exists today, he laments the fact that it's virtually excluded any study of psychedelic experience. He thinks that this is akin to zoology excluding any study of mammals. I'd go even further and say that it's like biology excluding the study of cells. Psychedelic experience provides such an important lens onto the structure and dynamics of consciousness and of pre-consciousness and trans-consciousness, or however you want to frame it. It's a boundary-dissolving experience, right? And as James said, no account of reality can be deemed complete until we have explored these other states of consciousness, because they correlate with other views of or aspects of reality. So Peter Josted, I'm going to share a lecture that he gave with you, so optional if you'd like to go deeper into his work, where he looks at the history of philosophy and sees what influence psychedelic mind-altering substances have had. It's quite interesting to track that. So you'll recall that the phenomenological tradition coming out of Husserl was searching for the kind of universal and necessary structures that shape our perception of the world and our thinking about the world. There was a phenomenologist, an existential phenomenologist, and a French philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre, who had an experience with mescaline, and it was a rather horrific experience for Sartre, where he experienced the absurd, and it's what we might call a bad trip. James and Blood and even Josted will also mention the way that the experience of the sublime when one is under the influence of these substances can be both heavenly and hellish. And the transition between the heavenly and the hellish dimension of these experiences can occur really in the blink of an eye. Sartre, unfortunately, got stuck in the hellish experience. He doesn't seem to have had any taste of the heavenly possibilities. He recounts staring at a sort of knot in the roots of a tree and just feeling the complete and utter absurdity of existence. I think he experienced himself transmogrifying into some sort of a crustacean, like a crab, and he just felt totally locked into his body, and quite a horrible experience. But other than that, this phenomenological tradition hasn't really explored the psychedelic experience, but there's a lot of work going on that issue now. So, just like James, Josted thinks that there are epistemological and ontological implications. He also thinks there are ethical implications coming out of psychedelic experience. Obviously, there's the healing potential that psychiatry and medicine is exploring right now. There's this issue of cognitive freedom as well, freedom of thought, right? If psychedelics can transform the possibilities for thinking that human beings are capable of, then one could say that the legalization of these substances is a cognitive liberty issue, right? If we don't want to control the thoughts of a population, then we shouldn't control the sorts of psychedelic substances that they can ingest. Granted that there are psychological risks here, it seems like for most of these substances, psilocybin, mushrooms, or mescaline, or LSD, or cannabis, that the physiological risks are actually quite low, certainly lower than alcohol or tobacco, so that adults should be able to engage in experiments with these substances without fear of being arrested by the government. Josted looks at how there are some psychedelic ideas in the history of philosophy. He looks at Henri Bergson, who's another process philosopher, his understanding of matter as an evolving creative process rather than just a collection of static particles. He looks at the German Kantian philosopher who was also influenced by Buddhism, Arthur Schopenhauer, who perceived reality in a panpsychist way as the reality that appears to us that seems like these solid bodies obeying laws. It's really the expression of this, for Schopenhauer, an underlying will. So Schopenhauer is inheriting a Kantian framework where there's a realm of appearances and then a realm of noumena, or things in themselves, and that we, as finite human experiencers, cannot penetrate the veil of appearance. And yet Schopenhauer is saying that if we were able to, we would perceive behind that veil not just things in themselves, but will, the expression of an infinite divine will. And so Josted looks at Schopenhauer and Bergson and Whitehead in particular and says, maybe these psychedelic experiences allow us to pierce the Kantian veil, to peer beyond the realm of phenomena into the noumenal or the archetypal world. And there's no evidence that Whitehead ever experimented with any of these psychedelic substances. It's not like he said he never did. There are some passages that suggest maybe he at least had secondhand accounts, spoke to people. He certainly read James's accounts. There's evidence that Bergson was interested in doing these substances. I'm not sure if he actually did or not. He wrote letters to William James, actually, where James was sharing some of his own experiences. I don't know about Schopenhauer. But one doesn't need to ingest these chemicals to have similar experiences, right? The reason that a lot of these psychedelic chemicals work is that they mimic endogenous neurochemicals, neurotransmitters. Human beings have been co-evolving with these plants and fungi that contain these chemicals for millions of years, and so there's a way in which our nervous system is not brain-bound, but in fact, in a very, very real physical, chemical way, extends out into the ecosystems within which we are embedded. So just because it may seem like our consciousness is housed inside of a brain, again, at a physical, chemical level, the brain extends out into the environment. So Josted goes through Whitehead's theory of perception. He describes it as anti-representational. We've had this representational theory of how the mind relates to the world come up a few times. The idea is that the mind creates a sort of internal model of the external world, right, and interprets that world, the material world, in terms of mental representations. In such a picture, which comes out of Descartes and Kant, and really is core to most modern philosophy, you're kind of left in a solipsistic position where the mind only knows the world in terms of its own language of thought, and there is no direct contact between the mind and the world, or between one mind and another mind, right? We're always having to filter our raw sensory experience into mentalistic terms, symbolic representations, and then reconstruct a model of the world in order to make any sense of that sensory experience. Now, for Whitehead, this whole picture needs to be rethought, and Josted goes through the ways in which Whitehead's theory of perception, his understanding of the relationship between what we call mind and what we call matter, is different. For Whitehead, perception, this is Josted, perception is not to be understood in the relation appearance to reality, but rather in the relation part to whole. Because for Whitehead, as I've described in past modules, our experience is not a mental representation of the objects in our environment. The objects in our environment actually stream into and penetrate our experience. We are re-experiencing what the objects in our environment experienced a moment ago, right? So Whitehead is saying that our environment is, as we perceive it in this moment now, is the perished experience of subjects of experience that preceded us, right? So a perished subject becomes an object inherited by the next moment of subjective experience, right? Our bodies serve as filters of this flow of experience from the environment and organize this flow of experience into the various sensory channels, right? Our brain serves as the sort of central organizer of this flow of feeling from our environment to present to us what's most relevant for our survival. That's why our bodies and our sensory organs evolved in the way that they did, for the purposes of survival, right? Allowing us to avoid threats and find food and find mates and so on. That filtering process, emphasizing the needs of survival, has, in Whitehead's terms, led to the negative prehension of so much of the other feelings in our environment, such that it takes a chemical alteration to sort of turn the dial of the reducing valve down, where the reducing valve is Aldous Huxley's term, right? So that, in Huxley's terms again, mind at large can then flood into our experience. Usually mind at large is filtered out because it's too overwhelming and we would not be able to navigate our environment in such a way that we could survive as organisms. So the psychedelic experience seems to turn down the reducing valve, allowing mind at large to flood in, right? And so Josted is using Whitehead's philosophy, and he really goes through and articulates, what Whitehead meant by an actual occasion and an eternal object, what apprehension is. And I hope you found not only Josted's review of Whitehead's philosophy, but Sherry Kling has her own review of these same ideas. I hope these reviews gave you a sense for how different Whitehead's approach to these questions is, and how much of an aid this new approach is to interpreting the psychedelic experience. For Whitehead, he takes an aesthetic approach to understanding the nature of reality, rather than thinking of the aesthetic as a dimension that's only relevant to human perception, whereas there's a whole other realm out there called the material realm where there's causality operating. For Whitehead, even causality is aesthetic, and aesthetic just refers to the transfer of feeling. The study of aesthetics, it's usually how we understand the notion of beauty, right? But aesthesis is just the Greek term meaning sensation, perception, feeling, right? And so for Whitehead, feeling is the primary glue of the universe. It's what holds everything together. And so he reinterprets the evidence of physics in aesthetic terms and says that what we experience as emotion, physics describes in terms of vibration, right? And that these are just two ways of looking at the same underlying relational process. So Whitehead's is in so many ways a psychedelic philosophy, a psychedelic account or description of experience. So Josted obviously is not all that keen on religion or traditional theology, and he acknowledges the role that God plays in Whitehead's thought is quite different from the role or the image of God in the Judeo-Christian traditions. Josted's very influenced by Nietzsche, and I think has more of an orientation toward pantheism or panentheism. He's a panpsychist, certainly, but he's not all that interested in these notions of a transcendent deity, where there is, I think, room in Whitehead's thought for both traditional Christians. Traditional Christians definitely need to revise some of the mainstays of the way that God has been imagined in that tradition in order to adopt Whitehead's theology. But there's room in Whitehead for Christians. There's room in Whitehead for pagans. There's room in Whitehead for Buddhists, right? There's a way in which Whitehead's theology, his understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, kind of leaves room for everyone. It's a very pluralistic approach to understanding the nature of the divine or the ultimate nature of reality. I think both theists and non-theists can find something in Whitehead's philosophy that speaks to their own view of the nature of the ultimate. So Sherry Kling is a process theologian, right, who's studied with John Cobb Jr. and others. And so she's presenting the more, I think, orthodox view of Whitehead's theology. Josted is reading Whitehead almost as a Satanist, or at least a pantheist, one whose God sounds more like, the Greek god Pan than traditional, Judeo-Christian images of God would. So you get a different flavor from each of them, from Josted and from Kling, as to how Whitehead's theology can be put to use. But Sherry Kling presented this paper that we're reading originally in 2017 at the International Transpersonal Conference that was in Prague. She references a conference that was at the Center for Process Studies down in Claremont, California in 1983, where James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, was present, and really the whole conference was an attempt to bring Jungian psychology and Hillman's approach to psychology into conversation with Whitehead's process philosophy. There's a great book called Archetypal Process that came out of that. There was also a conference at CIIS on transpersonal psychology and Whitehead in 1996. David Ray Griffin developed an account of Whitehead as a transpersonal thinker. And so Kling discusses all of this. She agrees with Hillman that we need to look at Whitehead's philosophy as a response to what in Hillman's terms is a metaphysical catastrophe, where basically the soul of the human being has been separated from the world, such that the world is in the modern period conceived of as soulless. And from Hillman's point of view, for the human soul not to have contact with an ensouled world it's a metaphysical catastrophe that has tremendous mental health implications, right? And so restoring some sense of contact with an intimacy between the soul and the world was one of Hillman's main projects, and Hillman acknowledged that Whitehead was a tremendous aid in this effort. So Kling goes through Whitehead's understanding of God in terms of a primordial pole of God and a consequent pole of God. God as, in the primordial sense, that which first realizes the best possibility for the becoming of the universe, and God in the consequent sense as the feeling or response to how the world struggles to actualize that potential, right? There's a way in which Whitehead's God needs finite creatures in order to fulfill its yearning after more intense experience, right? For Whitehead, the teleology of the universe, God's purpose is to experience beauty through the intensification of experience, right? And so God's role in the universe is to lure all of us, all actual occasions of experience, all organisms in this cosmic ecology toward ever more intense experience. And this is why, Josted says that this is unlike the God of the Bible, who's supposed to be good, right? Because the lure towards more intense experience isn't necessarily good in a simplistic moral sense, that some Christian theologians would have it. Whitehead's God is not moral in the sense that it's always leading towards goodness. For Whitehead, beauty is the highest ideal, and something is good to the extent that it increases beauty, right? So he's making, in a sense, aesthetics, again, is Whitehead's first philosophy, not ethics, not epistemology as with Kant. So it's a bit of a reorientation for those theological thinkers who are used to moralizing. Whitehead's theology is not moralistic, it's aesthetic. God wants beauty, and sometimes beauty is achieved through a kind of sublime suffering. So, Kling describes God as the initiating factor in each moment of experience, such that there is a divine otherness present at the core of our own experience in each moment. And that initiating factor, this what Whitehead calls the divine eros, the initial aim, is an ingredient in each moment of our experience. And it tries to lure us towards what's most beautiful, but we're not determined by that lure, right? We make the decision ultimately for how we are going to experience each moment of our lives. But God is present as an ingredient in each of these experiences, whispering to us and saying, come this way, try this out. It's up to us to decide which way we go. God's not in control of the universe. God is, in Whitehead's terms, the poet of the universe. And we finite creatures are participants in God's poetry. So, Kling does reference the participatory approach in transpersonal psychology and sees Whitehead as his cosmology as providing a sort of the metaphysical background that allows us to make sense of this participatory approach to spirituality and religion. There's a way in which James was already hinting at this idea he was critical of empiricists and rationalists, materialists and idealists. Why? Because they all thought, and this is James's own words now, they all thought that the mind comes upon a world complete in itself and has the duty of ascertaining the world's contents, but that this mind has no power of redetermining that world's character, right? James thought that the mind plays an active role in shaping the character of reality. It doesn't create reality. He's not a Kantian in that sense, or an idealist, but the mind has a role, a participatory role in co-creating how reality continues to unfold. This is James's belief, and he thinks that it's a psychologically healthy belief. And Whitehead takes James's psychology and articulates it, systematizes it into a coherent cosmological vision, right? Wherein it makes sense to claim that the mind has some influence, is a co-determining factor or a participating co-creator in the further unfolding of reality.